one, and so everybody can see it from the beginning. So yeah, these are superhero investor strategies for everyone here, using the powers of invisibility, tax reduction, and strategic business planning to help you keep more of what you earn. You're going to see a theme here where we're trying to keep more of what you earn because it applies from a liability standpoint as well as a tax standpoint as well. Another thing to mention is there's a third perspective, and that'll be your estate planning side, where it's also going to be relevant. So first question is what do we do? So Anderson Advisors, we are an education company as well. That's why we work with companies like like with Don here, and ultimately we are an education. We help service some of the different strategies that people talk about, or that some of them will talk about today. So ultimately, we are into educating our clients. So we're advising. So when we're advising them, we're speaking the same language. Because if I'm speaking about anticipatory repudiations and things like that, and it's not relevant to you, if we're in person, I can see your eyes gloss over, and we're not communicating. So we want to be able to at least communicate at the most basic level, so you know what you got and what you're doing as well. So yeah, we've put things under one roof that are traditionally spread out. So normally, if you're going to need legal help, you go to a lawyer. Normally, if you need tax help, you go to your CPA, and then you get bounced around about 100 different times before you can even get close to an answer. So through to credit to Clint and Toby, when they set up Anderson Advisors, they wanted it all under one roof because they had experienced that as investors and said, you know what, if we could put this under one roof, it'll go gangbusters. So ultimately, that's our goal here, is that we can communicate on the same level to help you preserve your assets, protect them, as well as grow them and prosper, so you and your family will enjoy the fruits of your labor, maybe this generation and probably the next couple, if you do the planning correctly. Who do we serve? We have clients from all over the world. We serve clients in all 50 states. We have our primary focus is real estate and stock investing. It's just one of those things that happens to go hand in hand with small business. So we can help. I've said in the past numerous times with some of my clients, they don't know if we can help them. They don't know if they're big enough, if they need these things. And I tell them, I say, listen, I work with hot dog vendors in New York and brain surgeons in California. So, we service everybody in between. So yeah, we want to, like I said, ultimately we're trying to help you keep more of what you earn, whether that's from Uncle Sam or from predatory plaintiffs that are out there. So let's see. And who am I? I'm Carl Zellner. I am an attorney, as Don mentioned. I'm here because number one, I love to teach. I also love to learn. So a lot of times you would catch me in your same seat listening to other presentations, especially from Don's group. There's lots of good presenters with lots of good material. I invest in real estate. I'm a stock trader, do cryptocurrency. And my most recent endeavor is trying to be a super dad to my youngest son. We had in 2022, at the end of 2022. So he is just coming up on 2 years old. And yeah, that's it's been awesome. And it's also been challenging. Those of you who have kids, I'm sure can relate, probably grandkids for some of you at this point. But yeah, definitely the super dad piece is always going to be, I would suspect, a project to be done, to do or have some additional pieces to add on to it. My specialty is working with small business owners and real estate investors to keep more of what they earn. Like I said, that's going to be a common theme, and limit their liability. Here is a picture of the aforementioned little bugger. This is my son. He's a junior, so he is a Carl A. Zellner Jr. And let's see, what is my why? He is my why at this point, him and my wife. This is why I work so hard. It's why I put so many hours in during the week. And this is why I speak to y'all this evening as well. Because ultimately, to get where we want to be takes time, effort, dedication, and ultimately just kind of a thirst for knowledge at the end of the day. So yeah, ultimately that's where we're going in this picture here. So that's my son. So one thing we want to look, or a couple things we want to look at, is there is some of this stuff that is predictable. So number one is you don't schedule getting sued by a predatory plaintiff attorney. However, you can predict it, because we know just by looking at the statistics, there's about 5 lawsuits that an investor goes throughout their career. So that's just the reality of the situation. So you need to prepare for it. There's also taxes, right? We know taxes are coming every year. I bet if we took a poll or saw some hands raised, if we were in person, I would bet there's still people who haven't done their taxes for this year, even though the deadline is today. So just like I said, there's things we can prepare for, things we can't. Death, death and taxes, right? We know both of those things are coming at some point. Hopefully, death is farther out than taxes. But then ultimately, what we want to do is still have a plan in place, because otherwise, you'll be giving a chunk of it to a guy dressed like me. So, an attorney, right? Because ultimately, if you have a will or no estate plan at all, your assets will be going through probate. All right. So let's go with some introductory pieces of asset protection. I think it's fair, and I think everybody would agree. I can't teach you all the things you need to know about tax and asset protection in what's going to be about a 1 hour time slot. So what I would say is we need to get introduced to the concepts, and then over time we refine. Our clients' understanding is more refined as time goes on, and you hit more educational opportunities. So some basics of asset protection. We got to start looking at the tools that are available. So number one, though, I want to talk about a couple of things or a couple of ways people go wrong. Number one is just following the layman's point of view. So that's your buddy told you because he knows or she knows that this is how you do it, and everybody else is full of garbage. The problem is the DIY website or service is asking you to give them the answers. And quite frankly, you don't know what you don't know. Currently, there is less than even 1% of all attorneys that practice in the area of tax and asset protection. So ultimately, you're already limiting your field. It's very specialized. It's very small group. We all sort of know each other. And so I can tell you that the layman friend who's saying, this is the way to do it, I would require some additional information. And we're going to tell you how to, a little bit later, we're going to tell you how to get that additional information so that you're going the right direction. How about the professional layman, or what I term the weekend warrior, right? Somebody's nephew is an attorney and they say they could put it together for you for nothing. My wife would be proud of me to say this because I am a sucker for a good deal, but she always says, if you buy it, you either buy it right or you buy it twice. So I will say that is very true with tax and asset protection. I can't tell you how many people I've sat down with over the years who lay out their story about how so-and-so took X amount of dollars to get them set up. Then they only made it about halfway through. And so they did it themselves. And now they got to start all over because they got sued. They lost everything. And now they need to basically go backwards and try to protect what they have left and start over. And it's terrible and it's sad. And I'm sure Don can even weigh in at some point as well. Not right now, don't need it, but ultimately, I'm sure there's lots of stories. I'm sure a lot of you have stories of friends or fellow investors who have run into terrible problems where that happens, or they tried to do it themselves only to find out they screwed something up. There's also just certain states that are really bad about concealing your information. So there's going to be also, I should mention as well, towards the end of this presentation, there will be time for additional questions as well. So if you're thinking of them or you think of them along the way, write them down and we'll address them. All right, so let's move on. Keep moving on. All right, bulletproof structures. So we're going to talk about entities and the role within your structure. Okay. So first one, most everybody's probably familiar with is the LLC. If it's usually a CPA or maybe a friend, Mr. What was it? The one I just said. So Mr. My friend said it's usually an LLC, and if they want to be fancy with you, they'll tell you taxes as an S corporation, which isn't necessarily, I should mention, is not necessarily the wrong tool, but it's a sort of limited view on what you can do with entities if you're working with somebody who can sort of make the artistic piece out of them, right? Like there's really some art that goes into structuring these things correctly so you get the maximum effectiveness and also minimizing the tax impact or maximizing your tax impact for certain situations. So very detail oriented on how these things are set up, but LLCs are cool because they're ultimately you can tax them as whatever you want. as well as structure them in such a way where you gain anonymity, as well as a superior level of asset protection than, say, where you're locally registered or where you're living at the time. So, yeah, there's some wide options out there that are always great to talk about. Limited partnerships. So these are sort of gone by the wayside over time. Used to be very, let's see, very popular in regards to family limited partnerships, because there was a group that ultimately figured that you could do asset protection and basically estate planning within the same entity. Does it work? Sort of. What I'll tell you, the downside is there has to be a general partner. So the general partner from a protection standpoint has unlimited liability, which is a bad deal, right? You don't want unlimited liability as an individual. There are ways to structure them though, if you're for whatever reason tied to an LP, that you can make them even safer. The more common practice these days, we tend to use them for our Canadian clients because the Canadian Tax Authority recognizes partnerships. They don't recognize LLCs. And if you think double taxation is something to be concerned about, you should see the Canadian triple taxation. If they see an LLC, a lot of times they're going to try to treat it like a corporation, and you will pay out the nose in Canada with taxes. So that's why you see so many Canadian investors. I find it kind of comes in waves, but yeah, they're out there and they got money and they're willing to spend it. So LPs though, so basically when we start talking about structures, where you see the blue box or the Wyoming LLC, for those of you who are somewhat familiar with our content, that swap that LLC for an LP there, and that basically takes care of you if you're one of our Canadian investors on the call today. So corporations, talked briefly about that. Corporations are a cool tool. A lot of folks will say it needs to be an S corporation. I'm here to tell you, C corporations are nothing to be scared of. I actually have one set up for my wife. So there's a weird like little bell curve that happens with corporations where it actually makes more sense in the beginning to start with a C corporation, because you can grab a lot more of the expenses. Then as time goes on and say you break, I don't know, the 50K mark on earnings through that business, then you can look at an S corporation. And then ultimately, when you really start getting into the big bucks where the pass-through entities stop providing so much tax benefit, then you really get into sort of the C corporation again, because it's best to handle active income. So you'll see that there, if I mean, I don't know, I don't have a slide or any statistics to show you. I can just tell you sort of anecdotally from working with clients over the years that there is sort of a bell curve where a C corporation makes sense, as well as an S corporation can also make sense. So there's a, like I said, it needs to be it's very detail oriented. So you need to have that be a bespoke structure for you, especially if you have an active business. Because I would say, raise your hand if you've heard of this before. But ultimately, there is something in Internal Revenue Code, Section 1202, that if you own a traditional C corporation for 5 years and then sell it, you can exclude the capital gains on $10 million of the sale. So it's a pretty cool deal from that perspective. A lot of tech companies use that, but certainly if you had a construction company or something like that, I think that would be probably a pretty good fit as well, just because ultimately the 5-year thing, and if you sell it for $6 million, who cares? I mean, you're exempt up to 10. So it sort of works like the individual personal resident exclusion with the 121 exclusion, which, the individual taxpayer, if you're a single person, sell your personal residence, you get up to 250,000 of tax-free gain, basically. If you're married, 500,000. In this case, it's with a business though, and it comes under Section 1202. And it, like I said, the C corporation can be a really cool tool to use there. It's just more about working with somebody who knows how to use it, because yes, if you're not careful or don't know what you're doing, you can hurt yourself. Trusts. So I look at trusts and just sort of affectionately as problem solvers. So I've got, say, let's just use a common scenario. When I dealt with a client today, they actually had a really good interest rate on some properties in place and didn't want to violate that, or had some due on sale concerns, which traditionally, up till this about year or so, didn't mean anything. As long as the mortgage was current, you could always transfer the property. Most cases you still can. I would just say from my perspective, I'm starting to get a little nervous that lenders are going to start to get greedy with investment properties and trying to call notes due. So I would just say a great problem solver for that is just to put it in a land trust. A land trust is an awesome tool. It's just a grantor trust, so same family as a living trust. And ultimately, what it does is you put the property in there, mortgage current. So I'm not going to tell you not you can't stop paying your mortgage, but mortgage has to be current. And then ultimately, long term, most lenders will just avoid it because there is something out there called the Garn St. Germain Act that protects loans that are on properties that go into grantor trusts. Ultimately, though, it speaks more to the personal residence than an investment property. But most lenders, from my experience, aren't looking that close. So I would say that's a great, if you've got a great interest rate on a property and you want to move it, a land trust is a really good tool to do that safely without violating the terms of your loan for all intents and purposes. Transfer tax is also a good use for the land trust. Uh, and what else? There's also, in Florida specifically, there's some big pieces there too. Because Florida has decided to now try, at least to some extent, try to be California's little brother in the fact that they now actually, if you just transfer one of your investment properties in Florida directly to an LLC, they will reassess it as well as charge you a stamp tax for any property that actually has a mortgage on it. So there's some key changes that have happened in that region of the country that are important to be aware of as well, because I know Florida is a very big investing place, just like California. And ultimately, as well, there's going to be in the future here, we all need to keep our eyes open because ultimately in Florida and California, it's also getting harder and harder to get insurance. So something to keep your eyes out on that as well. All right. So how do many of you look? If you've got stuff in your individual name, please watch the pictures very carefully. So bank, brokerage, crypto accounts, if they're in your individual names, you're basically, what you're doing is you're putting a target on your back, and what you look like is a pot of gold to potential plaintiff attorneys because they will sell that stuff and it's just cash to them. They don't care what your basis is in it. If you sold it at the time, would you make it? Doesn't matter. If it's in your name, it looks like cash. Is a good, I guess, way to say that. All right. So let's take a look at what a traditional structure would look like to you as the investor. Okay, so you can see all the pieces of it. In this scenario, what you'd be looking at, this is if you have, let's say, so that would be a Georgia rental property, an Arizona rental property, and it looks like a Texas corporation, and it could be flipping a property anywhere. The LLC just has to be where the flip is in this scenario. Then we have our Wyoming holding company. This is that blue box I referenced a little bit earlier. That is actually going to be owned ultimately by your living trust. In this case, I chose to make the couple from Texas because I grew up in Texas. So I put as much Texas stuff as I can on everything. Sorry for all you Oklahoma fans out there, and all you football fans know what I'm talking about, but those that don't worry about it. But anyways, this is what you can see from your side. And now we're going to see it from a different angle. Okay. Let's say you had a contractor on the property, or maybe even one of your tenants had a contractor on the property and they got hurt. Let's see what it looks like. So in this case, in the Arizona property, so they would be able to see if somebody pulled up the title of the property. So this is where an attorney would look up the title. Most places now you can actually just go in online and either look up the person's name associated, or even just the address, and it'll give you the rest of the information. So they would see, number one, all they would see is a land trust with what we would use as a nominee trustee on there. And then in order to do that, they would, if they had to serve you with a lawsuit, what they would do is then serve the trustee of that land trust. And then ultimately they would find out there's an Arizona LLC sitting behind it, which is sort of a dope move for the attorney. And then if they look up the Arizona LLC, they would see a Wyoming LLC. And I can tell you from anecdotal stories from my buddies I went to law school with, a lot of them working for big law firms, like international law firms, say even them, if they see Wyoming or Nevada entities or even Delaware entities, they avoid them because it's too expensive to go after. So we want you to be one of those people that it is too expensive to go after and that they move on to somebody else to pick their pockets. So yeah, the little pot of gold, because ultimately that's what they see. They can't see it. So in the prior picture, we see that the pot of gold is, let's see, yeah, next to the people down here in the silhouette. In this one, it is up in the holding company and nobody can see the Wyoming LLC. And we choose Wyoming because of its anonymity features, as well as its stepped up level of asset protection that we lovingly refer to as the charging order protections. So what does that charging order protections mean? Basically, it means that people can't force you to get things out of that blue box should something happen. So like, what does that mean from a legal perspective? It provides you some magnificent leverage if you're in this situation, because even if you got a judgment against you, they can't force you to give out any of your other assets that you had in your structure, because number one, they can't see it. Number two is if they question you about it, that's actually inappropriate. So make sure you have a relatively aggressive attorney in this scenario, because ultimately your Georgia rental had nothing to do with any liability situation that showed up on your Arizona rental where the injury occurred. So that's how you keep that private. And ultimately, that stuff doesn't become relevant unless you're somehow found liable. But last I looked, the statistics bear it out that over 95% of all legal cases actually settle before they even get to a final judgment. So that's where basically your sort of insurance and things would kick in, because that's a big question a lot of people have is, can't I just get more insurance? Insurance is great. Umbrella policies are great. However, if you're going to file a legal case, you basically make the case that's all things that insurance doesn't traditionally cover. So that's one thing we teach in the tax and asset protection class as well, is what are some of those things that what we look for and how do we protect against some of those items. So remember, this is what your structure looks like to you. Now, what happens if, say, people rarely think about this, but this is actually probably the more common scenario where people actually lose most of their assets. And what happens if you got into, say, a car accident? Okay. Now, what does it look like to outside parties? This is what it looks like to an outside attorney. It looks like it's just you, like to say, I'll put myself in the passenger on the driver's seat in this one. Say it's my wife and I in that car. Hopefully we made it out okay in this scenario. But ultimately, if this is us and we get in a car accident, nobody can see what I own because I have a Wyoming holding company. So I have an active business that's a little bit more public facing, but my holding company, my blue box that you'll see here again in a second, that is completely anonymous. So nobody can even see that. And then ultimately what we would say as well, it works as a great tool for your personal residence, is what we refer to as a personal residence privacy trust. And we can even take your name off that as well if anonymity is your primary concern. So you got to remember, right? Ultimately, we want to run or have our piggy bank sitting in our Wyoming LLC. You can actually have multiple of those if you wanted to divide them up. We have clients that have 4 or 5 of them for different purposes. Pretty cheap to maintain in Wyoming. So ultimately, it makes sense to have a couple. A lot of times, if you're going to be carrying more than, I don't know, maybe 250,000 in liquid assets at your Wyoming holding company, at that point, I would consider spinning it off into a second, and we'll just refer to it as a banking LLC. And that way you can actually keep it completely separate of any of those rental properties, any of the flips, the corporation, or your personal liability. So yeah, it would actually just be off to the side someplace. Okay. So we know what it looks like from if you got into a car accident, all they can see is you as an individual because you were driving the car. If from somebody got hurt on one of your rental properties, all they can see is that very limited branch of that. So you're not in any danger there. I mean, basically, your maximum risk of loss in that scenario would be that one property. Because I'll tell you, if everybody can sort of picture the Thanksgiving turkey we all drew as a kid, with your hand, I'll tell you, losing a finger is a bad day. Losing the whole hand is a terrible day. So yeah, ultimately we try to limit our liability. The overall strategy is by separation as well as anonymity, And the anonymity piece is something that everybody tends to like because it's sort of a neat little feature. But ultimately, if that anonymity even broke down, you would still have the highest level of asset protection. So you got a big bazooka in your corner should somebody come around poking around trying to get the cash in your pockets. Because what they look at all of us as is we have and they don't. So let's talk about the other, what folks perceive as bad guys. They're not bad guys. They're just people who enforce the rules the Treasury makes. It's the IRS. So they're actually, argue all you want about the overstepping, and I would agree with you. But ultimately, they're just a government agency. So if you treat them as such, basically it means as long as you stay within the black letter and white letter of the law, then you are going to be just fine. So what would the IRS see from this? From this is our, like I said, remember, this is what we can see. The IRS would see this, just your corporation, because they would be looking for a tax return, and your individual tax return in that scenario. So one more time for those of you at home who are maybe taking notes or screen pictures here. So we've got all these. So that's two rental properties, and it looks like a corporation with a flip going on someplace, doesn't matter where in this scenario. Our holding company and our living trust, the only tax returns that show up, corporation and individual returns in that scenario. Okay. Now, if you've got unrelated parties involved and partners, you'll have some additional tax implications there. However, they're not all bad. Having a partnership at that holding company level or that blue box level can actually provide some additional lending benefits as well, which we can talk a little bit about here in a second. Okay. So that holding company, that blue box, can either be taxed as disregarded or ignored for tax purposes, and it'll just flow through to these individuals, flows through the trust. The trust doesn't have a tax return either. And then, like I said, corporation and individual tax return. In that other scenario back there, had quite a bit going on. Like I said, really important from this perspective, whether it's a C corporation that's doing an 1120 or an S corporation that's doing an 1120S. The IRS is very creative in that regard as well, as you can see. But ultimately, you want to have somebody run the analysis for you on which one is best. I'll just tell you from this point, the S corporation tends to work better in businesses that are more services based, where you're living off most of the income. The C corporation is better if you're in a situation where you're trying to control more of the income. The good news from both of those perspectives on there is that either one of them can also sponsor things like solo 401ks. So these are your retirement accounts. Some of you probably have retirement accounts out there you're looking to combine so you can invest them. The corporation is a great tool for that because, like I said, it can sponsor. You can be an employee of the corporation and you can actually sponsor one of those 401 solo 401k accounts, which I believe this year you can contribute up to $69,000, which I'm not the best at math in the world, but it's a heck of a lot more than, I think, what is it, the 7,000 you can put into an IRA this year. So just a great additional tool out there for you. So yeah, let's get into the force multiplier that can be taxes, right? So great quote by a great judge. Judge Learned Hand. Is there actually a better name for a judge out there? But he's got the quote that's on point that everybody uses. So I'm going to repeat it as well because I like it. Anyone may so arrange his or her affairs that his taxes may be as low as possible. He is not bound, or she is not bound to choose that pattern which they will best pay the treasury. There is not even a patriotic duty to increase one's taxes. So I'm sure you've all heard that one before. Judge Learned Hand is the gentleman that came up with that, or is quoted in that phrase. So can't say it better myself, right? Ultimately, just because you could be paying more taxes does not mean you're required to be. There's not even a cherry on the top of the sundae for you at the end of the road because you've done it, is sort of the point, right? You can organize your taxes. And from the Anderson perspective, because we do have a tax firm that is also part of Anderson, we say, everybody should pay their fair share of taxes, but there is no point in leaving a tip. So if you're going to say, where do we sort of fall on the scale between passive and aggressive tax planning? I would say we're aggressive, but only up to the black letter of the law because we're not making guinea pigs out of our clients. So, all right. So our process is pretty simple. Pre-education. This is what this is. I'm introducing you to some concepts. Some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not be. That's why we are introducing you to them. Next, there is a foundational, it's usually 1 or 3 day tax and asset protection educational event that you'll get an invite to as well as the continuing education that you get from Don's company as well. Number three, once you've attended one of those educational classes and you want to have a consult, technically you can do your consult anytime you'd like, and you can actually get your own wealth planning blueprint. So for the clients I work with, what I do is when we have our first phone conversation that talks about their assets and some individual planning, I will draw them a wealth planning blueprint. I usually get it to them pretty quick, usually within about 24 hours. And that way, if they have questions, we can further discuss those questions until the point you're comfortable. I've been working with one lady for now 3 months just to get everything in place because she has an amazing portfolio that she spent last, I don't know, her and her husband spent the last 30 years building on the East Coast. And there is storage units, there's gyms, there's restaurants, there's a bunch of different stuff in there. And so I'm helping walk her through that step by step. So we're just about to get to the Delaware Series LLC that some attorney set up for her Maryland properties that I'm helping her salvage because technically they should be in a Maryland Series LLC if there was one, but Maryland doesn't offer them. So we're using land trusts, like I said, my little friends who solve a bunch of problems. Wealth planning blueprint is key because I don't know about y'all, but I'm pretty visual. So I like to see the overall concept and plan before I commit to something. All right. And then more education. So ultimately, when we do a class, so whether that's our tax and asset protection class or part of what we help Don's group do as well with the tax and asset protection class, ultimately, that's just the first level of the Anderson education when you work with us. Second level is called structure implementation. So basically, now that you know what the entities are and your options are, and you have a blueprint in place, ultimately what that means is that now you will go through a whole class. It's usually a 2 day long class that talks about now that you got them, what is Anderson going to do to help you keep them compliant? And what do you need to be doing to keep your business compliant? Because otherwise, if you haven't been doing those things, then quite frankly, when you get sued, you might as well just turn the papers over and let them know everything you got. Because if you're not being compliant within your own entity structure, you're basically not respecting the entities and its structure. And there is a great amount of legal work on the aspect of if you're not respecting your entity structure, a judge is unlikely to respect your entity structure as well. And that goes for either lawsuit or audit of your tax situation. So make sure you're on top of those things and working with somebody who can help you with them. All right. So good advice anytime now and beyond. So number one is passive investments should be held anonymously with an eye on tax. I just saw a structure from somebody coming into our business of a new client. One of the other employees at Anderson had a question and reached out to me, and I looked at it today actually. And there was somebody who came in that had 11 rental properties in 11 LLCs taxed as S corporations. And I can tell you from here, it's probably a CPA that set it up because that is 11 S corp returns that they are going to charge this doctor with. So that's usually you can sort of tell who's setting up the structure just by where the pot of gold is at the end of the rainbow. And this one, it's tax returns. So I would say that's most likely a CPA who set it up. I don't know that to be a fact. My years of experience at this point are telling me that's probably what it is. All right, number two, anytime a property sells from an LLC, because you can sell your properties directly out of an LLC or a land trust if we have a land trust set up for you, it should be dissolved, right? And the perspective or the strategy behind that is simple. If somebody gets buyer's remorse and goes to look up who owns it, and the entity's been dissolved, it looks like it's out of business. This is the same reason we don't sue homeless people because they don't have anything to collect on. So if we can make it look like you've got nothing to collect on, Bob's your uncle, you're on your way. And, ultimately the attorney will go to find some other low hanging fruit instead of you. Number three, the return on business and tax planning is exponential. So just like that code section I mentioned a little earlier, that's section 1202, some of you out there are probably slapping yourself on the head going, why didn't I reach out and have a consult? Because I left, probably in a lot of cases, you could be leaving north of $1 million on the table if you don't know what you're doing. I actually have a client as well who is receiving $90 million for a platinum mine in Africa. And ultimately, they went to UBS, which is a large bank. This is not to besmirch UBS, but they went to their wealth management center so that they could all have a big meeting. And they were telling them how they're going to make them all this money and do all these things. And ultimately, they didn't have a way to handle the income though on the $90 million. So myself and a colleague told them was, listen, if you can choose how they're going to pay you, set up a C corporation and have them pay the C corporation. Because right now, the income on the C corporation is going to be capped at 21% tax. Yes, you'll have some net investment income tax. That's fine, but it's still less than the 37% you'd be paying as an individual because you hit that 37% mark after about $700,000. So I'll let y'all do the math on it, but he saved about, I don't know, I think when I figured it, it was pretty close to about $16 million in about 5 minutes. So I think you can guess that he's probably going to be a client for a long time, right? But yeah, even big banks and things like this don't know how to put some of this stuff together. So it's one of those things that you should definitely talk to somebody who knows what they're doing. Just so you know, I'm not full of malarkey. There is about 100 million lawsuits that get filed every year. Now that is inclusive of small claims and also divorce and things like that and evictions. But they also didn't list the amount of money that came out of those. And like I said, from doing these events and doing seminars and things like that, I can tell you when they were more in person, used to have at least a few people a year come up to me and basically and also say, I just don't want to have to start over again. I'm 60 years old. I can't hardly start over now. I definitely can't do it again. So let's plan correctly this time and build from a firm base. Sort of funny, not funny on that perspective, but interesting maybe in that for, like I said, the average is about 5 during your investing career. You'll run into lawsuits. I actually was, before I became an attorney, I got sued as I was running bars and nightclubs to earn money for my family back in, I don't know, maybe 2010. It was farther back than that. It was early 2000s and took 12 years for the case to be heard. Then by the time the case got heard, the judge screwed up and let an alternate juror deliberate. And it was actually in Colorado where it happened. And it actually ended up going to the Colorado Supreme Court. So that was not a fun experience. And that is actually where I learned as well that insurance that pays for attorneys is not good insurance and not good attorneys, unfortunately, either in that scenario. So just as a experience for y'all to know as well, because like I said, there are lots of people who always ask, can I just get more insurance? You can, but just be aware that they also set limits within the policy and that so those of you familiar with Denver, we started at a downtown high rise in Denver and ended up in a strip mall in Aurora. So it's a suburb that's not known for being the nicest suburb at the time. And then ultimately the day of court or the first day of court, our attorney pulls up in a, what's called just you can Google it, it'll make you giggle a little bit, pulls up in a 20-year-old Suzuki Kazashi and ultimately asked us to help him carry his boxes in. So me and the other folks that were working that evening that got sued. So didn't own the business, was just working there and got pulled in. So how easy do you think it is to get pulled in when you actually own the asset that somebody wants to go after? And the answer is it's incredibly easy, especially if they can see you on it. So I would say probably about 50% of what we do on sort of the asset protection structuring side is built as preventative medicine. And then the rest of it is just to make sure you're bulletproof and can stand up if for whatever reason you need to stand up. So it's incredibly important. And like I said, many of you probably have your own stories about friends or even yourself that would add to that. So yeah, the overall thing, don't be low hanging fruit. I took this picture because I think it's funny. Personally, when I went to law school, um, I was broke as a joke. I mean, my law school alone was $238,000, and I'm about half a million in on education. So don't be the low hanging fruit. When my wife and I were in Texas, I went to law school in Fort Worth. Ultimately, what we did was, and I say we, it was me. I went on online one night because she wanted a security system for the house because I worked 60 hours a week when I was in law school. So she wanted to have something in place. So when I was gone at night, because I started in the night program, that she would feel safer. Now, I argued that we had two Rottweilers and a bunch of guns at the time. So, every room's kind of a safe room in that scenario. But I wanted to make her feel better about it too. So what I did is I went on eBay and bought a ADT yard sign with some window stickers and stickered the bejesus out of the house. So ultimately, what did that do? It made me less appealing than my neighbors for somebody who doesn't have any. Now, did I have the system? No, but I looked less appealing than most, if not all, of my neighbors who had no security sign at all. So it sort of is this, like I said, some of it's preventative medicine. Did it prevent anything? Who knows? Ultimately, I can't say that it did, but nothing happened. So, for this story, let's just say it worked, but never had a break in, never had any real issue except for a couple of enormous garden snakes that would crawl across the driveway every once in a while and just hear a lady down the street scream. So, like I said, not all of it has to be 100% bulletproof. Some of it is a smokescreen. Some of it is don't be the low hanging fruit. Because if it's in your name, and like I said, I grew up in Texas. I'm licensed in Texas. Went to law school in Texas. Went to undergrad in Colorado, sort of randomly enough, and played football for Gary Barnett. But ultimately, what I would look at is that in the case of the ADT sign, it's sort of a good illustration of doesn't have to necessarily be anything behind that paper tiger. However, with what we set up at Anderson, you do have the protection as well. So it would be like in that scenario, let's just keep drawing out the comparison here. It would be in my scenario, it would be like having the ADT signs and then having three sort of redundancies behind it to protect everything as well. So, or what is it, the F around and find out sign hanging on your front door as well, and then a picture maybe of the dogs out front, and then so I mean, ultimately, it's like I said, it's preventative medicine as well, but ultimately, when you set it up correctly, you get the deterrent aspect as well as the not just the bark, but also the bite. And so, like I said, when people start seeing things like a Wyoming entity, they avoid it because it's expensive, and most law firms don't, got to pay to keep the lights on as well. So everything's got to be profitable. And it's just less profitable to go after Wyoming entities. Okay, how about some questions? I'm going to go through a couple frequently asked questions, and then I'm also going to reach into there's a question and answer section and start answering those questions as well. Unless Don, you got something else you want me to do?
No, let's just tackle these.
Okay.
Okay, first one. North Dakota resident. He's married, got two kids. He wants to give 50% of his estate away to charity. Can he do this without the consent of his wife?
I believe in North Dakota you can. So yeah, what I would say though is a consult would be great for you because also we can look at different tools like also a charitable remainder trust and things like that where you can get some tax benefit you on your side for in your lifetime as well. So there's some things you can dial in. There's cruts and slats and all sorts of things. But yeah, I would say that you're our prime. Number one is it's awesome that you have a philanthropic heart. Many of us at Anderson do as well. I'm actually working doing some pro bono work for one of our employees who just had a spouse die or killed in action. So I certainly also am on there with you as far as the philanthropic piece as well. But yeah, I think in or excuse me, in North Dakota, you would be able to, but I would have to double check.
But generally, assets acquired during the marriage um, are community. you,
Yeah, they're
North
community.
Dakota
They
is
are a lot of times they're going to be community property, but I
right.
don't think North Dakota is a community property state.
No,
The other thing is too is I'm
it's
sure
certainly not.
it's what.
It's certainly not a community property state.
Okay. So, but yes, that's why I say if it's not a community property state, technically if it's your separate property, you can give it away. But what I would say is it still needs something to talk about though, because I think to Don's point, even places that aren't community property states, a lot of times have rules that sort of make them that way that may require that. However, I would suspect if you're a good enough person, you want to give away half your estate, that your wife is probably on the a relative similar page and would at least not want to be arguing against doing that. So, something to number one, something to talk about with your wife. But I would also suggest just having her on the call because ultimately we can talk through some of those different scenarios as well.
Great. Dave is asking, does the trust own the shares of the Wyoming LLC or is it assigned at death? How does that work?
It's a great question, Dave. So ultimately, what you look at for number one is with the Wyoming LLC. There's no such thing as shares in an LLC. It's membership interest, but don't feel bad about that. Judges actually, and many legal opinions actually get that distinction wrong as well. So you're at least as good as a few federal judges on cases I've read recently. So yeah, what I would say to answer the question though, the trust would ultimately hold the membership interest of the Wyoming LLC. And basically, the way that works is whatever else the Wyoming LLC owns is therefore incorporated through that Wyoming LLC. So it becomes very easy to run your business, especially, like I said, because it does not generate additional tax returns in most cases, unless we specifically plan that for you. If you're using debt for purchases and things like that, there's some guidance that would be helpful at the holding company if we charged it as or changed it to a partnership. So we can look at that as well. Usually I'm looking at that for people with, I don't know, 3 or more properties. So it's not a very high bar, but it's something to discuss. And usually people with 3 or more properties who are planning to expand their portfolio by at least 3 or 4 properties a year. So
Okay,
good question.
good. Lawrence is saying, what a valuable session. Thank you for that, Lawrence. And then Keisha, how do you change the tax status of a legal entity? What forms are we using?
There's a couple,
How
yeah.
do you
So
do
there
it?
is yeah, thank you. So there's a couple different ones. There's the 8832, which you can change the taxation. And then there's also the 2553, which is a more common one where you can elect for your LLC. I believe that's the one that you file to elect it as an S corporation.
Right. The 8832 is for to elect to tax something as a partnership or as a C corp, and the 2553 is an election to tax it as an S corp. But
Yeah,
um,
and fun fact is if you're going to do the S corp route, you just do the 2553. You get to skip the 8832.
right.
Some people try to do both. There's no point. They just throw the first one away. So okay.
Okay. Dave is talking about, you mentioned separating assets. Is
Yes.
the concern with how much is in the LLC or what are we basing it on? And it's not necessarily the value as much as it is this a safe asset or an unsafe asset? Carl, will you kind of explain that?
Yeah. So what we look at is when we separate assets is not only say the value of the asset, but is it number one, also is it cash producing and what level of risk is it at, right? Because ultimately, if I've got a rental property, then each rental property, technically from a best practice perspective, should have its own LLC. Now, that doesn't mean that it has to be a $7 million rental property or something like that. That just means that it produces cash flow and it's appreciating. And it took me a lot of times to get it. So I want to have it separate so I don't lose it. A lot of times, what you'll run into is actually the lower cost properties ROI is higher than the higher ones. So you, like I say, we don't only consider one piece of that. We try to take a holistic view on the asset to say, hey, this should have its separate piece. Now, I know a lot of you as well. We also talk about, we talked a little bit about stock investing, crypto. I know a lot of you probably have a little bit of all that. That can be separated out as well if you wanted to, since it's more digital from that perspective. We would tend to use Wyoming entities. Just to give you a perspective on maintenance on that, where California is a minimum of that $800 franchise board tax a year. In Wyoming, it's $62 a year to maintain an entity. So it's pretty low for the type of protection and anonymity you can have. Most people usually will cap out at about 2 or 3 Wyoming entities at some point. Mostly it's used as an organizational tool because for $62 a year in Wyoming, that's not such a big deal.
Yeah. So Dave, the answer is it depends, but the factors are what state is the assets in? What state do you live in? Are they safe assets? Because if you had $1 billion worth of brokerage accounts and cash and things that don't cause lawsuits, you'd stick those all in one indicate or one, but that would be different if we had a lot of money in real estate. Then we're protecting the assets from each other. And so, Dave, it's not a real easy answer to
I
answer.
guess that's kind of the overall point is in a world where you can have get free consults and have a conversation, why not do it? I mean, ultimately,
There you go.
if you've learned something, why not do it? Ultimately, like I said, I'm willing to personally, and there's lots of great advisors like me over at Anderson. Now, I'm a little partial to me, of course, but what I would say is there's lots of great advisors over at Anderson, and why not? What if 45 minutes can completely change the sort of the path or your tax picture or something? The cost benefit is off the wall. I mean, like I said, for that one client that was getting that platinum mine payout, $16 million in 10 minutes. I mean, I can't charge that rate, but you get the idea that there's things out there that like that happen. More common scenarios I would say that happen are ones where you're working your W-2 job and maybe you're due a large bonus or something like that. We can plan around those type of things too. So we look at those, like I said, from your picture as individuals. Is there some sort of standardized things that are involved? Yes, everybody should have a living trust in place because it'll help you avoid probate. The holding company is sort of a staple that shows up in most of our entity structures, but they're all tailored to what you're doing because each of those little factors change the overall picture just a little bit. But that little bit can be key if somebody gets hurt on one of those properties. And sometimes you don't, I mean, ultimately, nobody wants anybody to get hurt on their property, but you don't have that. Sometimes you don't have that option to, you can't, unless you got the best crystal ball in the business, there's no way to predict the future, and quite frankly, from my perspective, I wouldn't want to. That's not my place here. So I can help put you in a position to be protected and give you the best tax advantages and the tools at your disposal. But ultimately, yeah, there's still risk to work with, and that's where the insurance comes in at the end.
Okay. So next question is CPAs set them up with a separate entity and a separate tax return for every rental property. How would you simplify that, Carl?
So I would set them up mostly as disregarded entities unless there was a reason we couldn't. So sometimes some of the reasons you can't is if you have a unrelated taxpayer. So like if it's not your husband or wife and you're not filing jointly, uh, so like a brother or sister maybe on a property or properties, those would have to be taxed as partnerships. So that's a scenario where I could see that happening. However, most CPAs will just set you up that way because they think that's right. So, ultimately that's a difference of opinion there. I would set you, if it's just you and your wife or something like that with your real estate portfolio, pretty much everything would be a disregarded entity until we had a reason for it not to be.
And remember what Carl said, less than 1% of the nation's attorneys specialize in tax and asset protection. And so Be careful who you're listening to. How's that? Okay. Um, Retiree living just off CDs. Is there any type of asset protection available?
I would have to take a look. Different CDs allow different holders. I think you could actually probably put it into one of a Wyoming holding company to at least keep it safe because it really sort of just functions as a high interest savings account at this point. But it would depend a little bit on the CD as well as the CD offering as well as the bank. So I
And
would,
and Carl and the group would probably also look at the size of the accounts. Because if you got a lot of money in there and you're paying too much in taxes, maybe they could take a corporation, have it manage the LLC that owns all the CDs, and now be able to deduct home office expense and internet and cell phones and things that you can't otherwise deduct. So, um, Carl, there's a could they help you potentially protect the CDs as well as give you some taxes tips? Yeah, I
yeah,
think so.
yeah, basically to your point, if there's a way to move them into some place, you can certainly be able to charge a management fee or something like that. And we didn't even get into into the depths of sort of the tax picture. I know Scott and Pat like to do that as well. So yeah, there's like I said, I would say first place you start is always the same place. Have a consult because what do you have to lose?
Yep, good. Can I have access to the recording? Yes, this is being recorded, and we will send it out to everyone who registered for this webinar tonight. But it usually takes us about 24 hours, and so yes, we will send that out to everyone.
Awesome.
Okay, I have a rental property in Florida and a rental in Maine. My residence is in Massachusetts. What's the best way to structure this? You showed that you just used different states, didn't you?
Yeah, yeah. So a couple of things I would ask you during our conversation, Stephen, are is going to be number one is do you have debt on the property? So is it mortgaged? Also, I would ask you if you have insurance in Florida, is it you keep it in place as best you can. That's another piece of that. Ultimately, what it looks like from a picture perspective is basically I had a Georgia and an Arizona property. You saw on the visual depiction. Basically, you flip that for Florida and Maine. Florida definitely gets a land trust. Maine probably gets a land trust as well, just depending
Okay.
on the debt, if there's debt and transfer tax. And I'm trying to remember, I think Maine actually does have a small transfer tax, but usually even a small transfer tax is more expensive than a land trust. So just as an FYI.
Okay. Kathy is saying, or asking about charitable remainder trusts, and you mentioned several different types of trusts in there. What would be the advantage of doing that?
So a charitable remainder trust is nice, and I'm sure you've had John Anderson on as well that talks a little bit about these things. But the basic idea with the charitable remainder trust is you're planning to leave a chunk of your estate to charity, and you can actually take a tax break while you're still alive. So you set it up. There's like I said, a charitable giving aspect to it. And the IRS says, great, we like that you're giving to charity, so you can actually take some of that benefit now.
Yeah.
And then you usually draw some income off of the charitable remainder trust as well over time.
Yeah. And I've written several articles and chapters in books on CRTs, and but I don't set them up, and Anderson can help you with that.
Absolutely.
All right. Go. Yep. Okay. Does a rental property have to be owned by an LLC before it can be placed in a land trust? And it's actually the other way around, isn't it?
Yeah, so actually, the way it works is the title of the property is held in the land trust, and then the LLC is the beneficiary of the trust. So there's three pieces to the trust. There's a grantor, there's a trustee, and a beneficiary. The grantor in this scenario would be you as an individual. You would grant that property to the land trust. We would suggest using a nominee trustee. Right now, it's been Clint Coon's son, Carter Coons. If you just sort of get the standardized version, you can also have the option of setting up your own LLC to serve as trustee as well. It's just a name that goes on title, and that gives you complete control. And then as the beneficiary, for the beneficiary of a land trust, what you look for is what kind of protections are you looking for? And in this scenario, you would want it to be an LLC who's the beneficiary. So it has the same protections as basically putting that property into an LLC. By the way, I'll mention a note for some clients. I've actually been working on putting land trusts into a Wyoming series LLC for a couple of California clients and things like that. And they've been having some success with that. So just some, by the way, when we have our consultation, if that's something you're interested in, reach out and we can talk about some of those options as well.
So the property goes in the land trust, avoiding the $800, um, uh, I call it the
Franchise.
extortion fee,
Yep,
but
that's accurate too.
which is then owned by the Wyoming. Yep. Okay. Cool.
Yeah,
Oh,
funny, a little bit funny story about the franchise board is
yeah.
one time I made the mistake. My wife is from Southern California. We were spending some time with my in-laws during over the Christmas holiday one year, and I actually sent a mortgage payment from her mom's house. And they sent me, it took about a year, but they sent me a paper that said I'm now a California resident and owe them for X, Y, and Z and all these other things. And it was like, no, my friend, I don't. I never intended to live in California and went through the entire test on if you're a resident of California, and to which they finally sort of succumbed and were like, okay, well, just be aware that we know what you're doing. It's like, okay, well, you know what
But
I'm
they
doing.
didn't apologize. They just,
Of
yeah,
course not.
okay.
Why would they ever apologize? It works, whatever they're doing works so well. To the extent that if you even challenge the state of California franchise board, they will the court or the appropriate court for making that challenge is the franchise board court. Which, if that doesn't sound like a kangaroo type of scenario, I don't know what does.
All right. John is asking about the Las Vegas dates again. And our summit is coming up November 11th, 12th, and 13th. And then do you have a class coming up in Las Vegas? Did
We
you
do.
mention
It's
that?
in this. It's like the first week of December. Let me just pull it up real quick. So let's.
Okay.
Yeah,
Is that your tax and legal?
it is. Yes,
And that's a live event.
live
Ours
event,
is a
3 days.
virtual event.
Nope.
And so, John, I'm not sure which class you're talking about, but the next 3 day summit is coming up in November. And John, you've been to them in the past. So, okay, Carlton, what's the best entity for a second home non-rental?
So yeah, second homes, vacation homes, things like that are we treat all like investment properties. So just like a rental property. Even if you're not renting it out, you still treat it like an investment property.
So, Carlton, what that means is if it's in Florida, it might be an LLC. If it's in Pennsylvania, they might use a sleeper deed. If it's in Texas, it might be a series LLC. The answer is it depends on where the property is, not necessarily what's the use of it. Okay,
And yeah, the Anderson event is December 5th through, they actually have it going through the 8th because I think there's some other unique new day 4 thing going on. So I think there's actually a networking opportunity on the 8th. So yeah, you should be able to access the sign up online. Uh, my suggestion would be though, is just when you have your individual consultation, just ask, and an advisor like myself or somebody else is happy to send you the link as well.
okay. And Carlton, I would suggest a consultation and see where that property is located. Okay,
Absolutely.
I'm getting ready to retire. I want to continue flipping, but limited income to 22,000 before they start limiting my benefits. Should I use a C corp and pay myself as an employee? That would allow her to throttle the income.
Yeah, I would. Yes. So yeah, number one is C corporation would allow you to sort of manage your income. The other piece I would look at on there though is I would need a more full picture of your tax scenario because yeah, number one is yes, the C corporation would definitely help. Also, I don't know how old you are, Miss C, but we could also still be looking at possible use of your retirement accounts and things like that as well, or setting up retirement accounts off of that C corporation, and that would keep you from in most cases keep you from violating that 22,000 and basically turning your benefits taxable is what you're trying to avoid there. So yeah, there's some options out there, but yeah, C corporation would help you because you can actually control the income. In the S corporation, you would be required to pay a reasonable salary, which becomes a bit of a sticky wicket on audit. If you're doing something that somebody's paying themselves, $200,000 a year for, and you're doing, 13. So,
Okay. Gene is asking, it looks like he's got rental properties of some kind in Florida. Would
mhm.
would tra would putting them like in a Wyoming entity avoid the transfer taxes he's paying in Florida?
No, so putting them in a land trust would help avoid the stamp tax in Florida, which is the transfer tax in Florida. You can look at for the beneficiary LLCs of each of those land trusts, though. That's a potential scenario we could look at, maybe using that Wyoming series I was mentioning as well. Um, but that's not a consistent strategy yet, so I wouldn't be broadcasting it. So it's one of those things that we can look at, but I would say it needs a conversation because you need to understand the risk of doing that as well.
Okay. And are we advocating consoles? Yes, because some of these questions are not there. There's not an easy answer to, and the answer is almost always, well, it depends.
Well,
And
and it's
so
not fair. It's not fair of me to ask you questions and you have to type out the answers, and I can just sort of rattle them off as I'm reading them. So yeah.
right.
Yep.
Okay. Next one. What is the difference between having rental properties in a land trust or in an LLC?
So usually it involves both. So I personally wouldn't, I mean, there's only one place I would really set up land trusts that maybe didn't have an LLC as beneficiary, and that's Florida. But that's very limited because even land trusts, they have a little bit of protection in Florida. It's not complete. So why would we do for lack of a better term here, a half butt job protecting you when we could just do it right from the start?
Okay, good. I have a disabled child. Do I use a different trust or do I use a revocable trust with just special needs clauses inside of it?
I would use a normal revocable trust with special needs clauses inside of it, and also spend some time educating your successor trustee.
Good, good. And that is a great question.
Yeah,
And
very good.
sometimes you have all these different names for trusts. And most of those are marketing terms. I need a special needs trust. Well, it's a revocable living trust but we're going to take special clauses inside in a couple paragraphs or a page or two and say, but we can't distribute so much to a child that it disallows their benefits. So,
Right.
but it's okay. What's the best tax structure for a new business? LLC based off profit? How do you determine?
So I guess I'm Keisha, I'm assuming you're probably asking, does it need to be taxed as a C or S corporation? That for sure is a conversation because it's going to require, like I said, sort of understanding if you're going to try to live off almost every cent that's coming through it, what type of business it is, and also what are your sort of long-term plans for it, which by the way, any business owner will tell you will probably change about 20 times in the first year or two.
Good. And Keisha, it depends a little bit on the state that you live in. Um, some states will charge more tax for corporation or LLCs than they do corporations, like California. It depends on how much money you're putting in as a startup expense, whether you plan to sell the business or whether I, it depends. Sorry, but it depends. Okay. Thank you. Thank
You all
you.
seeing a theme here. Ultimately, it's going to depend on a lot of these. So that's why you need to have the consultation so you can get those questions answered for your scenario and also that visual depiction of what you asked and answered.
And Carl, at the top, you've got um, some telephone numbers. What are those for? Do you see those in the top of your screen?
Oh,
I see
the one that says
Irene, Bobby,
Irene,
and
but yeah,
Amanda.
so those that actually I'll move those, but yeah, Bobby is
Oh,
my paralegal, Irene is my admin, and Amanda is also my second paralegal because I've been with Anderson long enough. I've got enough going on that I need all those people. So that
Okay,
helps me
so
remember their, that just
if they
helps me
wanted
remember.
a consult, what do they, how do they get it?
I'm glad
What,
you asked.
yeah,
Hold on
let's,
one second here. So those of you with your phones, get them ready. And we've got a QR code. There you go. And you can scan the QR code, and that'll be good for a consult. And I'll give everybody a couple minutes here. Do we want to keep handling some questions? Looks like we got a few more.
you know what, why don't you read those? Let me find, Amy sent me
A link.
a, a link. So
Okay.
I'm gonna copy that and put that
All right,
in.
I'm going to read questions while you're doing the link here then.
Okay,
So
great.
Nicoletta asks, what is the role of a registered agent? When we renewed the filing for an LLC, do we need to use the agent? So Nicoletta, great question. A registered agent is basically just somebody who is there during normal business hours to receive what's referred to as service of process. So if you get served with a lawsuit. Ultimately, where most DIYers screw up is they become their own registered agent, and ultimately that gets posted all over the Secretary of State website. So most people or most attorneys know at this point, number one, just sort of put into Google the address of the registered agent. And if it shows up and looks like a house, it's probably the individual that owns the LLC. So a lot of times as well, you'll see in states that actually list the owners or managers of the LLC because they're not consistent. But the registered agent is a, like I said, if you're serving as your own registered agent, number one, that's pretty much guaranteed to show off that it's amateur hour on the entity setup. Number two is it's just a bad idea unless you like being interrupted during, Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner with a knock and a lawsuit.
Yeah, if I wanted to set up a legal entity in California, I don't live there anymore. And so they want somebody that has a physical address, who's a real live person who can open the door and sign a letter, um, and not have to track me down in wherever I'm at that day.
Well, and
That's
the
a
danger
registered
is
agent.
too is if they come to your house. So if you did list, if you're one of those DIYers who did list your personal address and you're not home, they
Yep.
count that as being served on a lot of places. So ultimately, you can get a default judgment against you, which basically means you didn't get to respond to lawsuit, and they just gave the plaintiff what they were asking for, and now you just see it show up as like wage garnishments and things like that. So yeah, it's important to have a registered agent who knows what they're doing. I can tell you, as people in our basically our different locations have reached out to me over the years, there is some pretty creative schemes where people try to get information out of the registered agents. I know what we do for our clients on our side because we serve, I should mention as well, we do serve as registered agent in all 50 states. And then, so ultimately, I can tell you sort of how we handle those sort of phishing expeditions when people reach out. I've even seen one with a .gov website or a .gov email address that was not from the government. So I don't know how they manage that, but my technological understanding probably just doesn't reach that far. But that's why it's important to use a good registered agent as well, because like I said, I know how we respond. We respond, I'll let my client know if that person is a client, and they will respond how they see fit. So,
Okay, good. That link is in your chat screen. So click on that. That'll take you right to sign up for a consultation.
okay.
Um, and we can't make it easier than that. So you can scan it or click on it.
And I
Okay.
told Amy before we started this, I wanted the leads, at least the first, I think, at least the first 5 to 10 that sign up, you'll get to meet with me directly if you've been educated at
Cool.
all or entertained. So,
Thank you, Carl. If you
absolutely.
have an LLC now and it's not anonymous and you want it to be Wyoming LLC, do you need to disregard the old one and start the new one? Would the history show the owner? Yeah, if you've put a property and titled it into the name of an LLC, will that show up as you continue? Yes,
Like the
go
chain of
ahead.
title of a property. Yeah.
The
I mean,
chain of
so yeah,
title
the,
is
the
going to be on
chain
there.
of title with an entity still exists as well. So in most cases, if we're talking about, I mean, we can look at that when we talk to. Ultimately, what you look at is what's the risk, what's the reward, and if it makes sense, it makes sense. Most cases and most people I meet with at this point understand that if they want to build from something that's anonymous, it's worth a little bit extra expense to start fresh.
Okay, and so explain to us then Would you use a warranty deed in that case instead of a quit claim deed?
So personally, I would always use a warranty or a grant deed over a quit claim just because, and ultimately, I don't know how much, I mean, the from a law perspective, they refer to titling of assets like properties and things like that as a bundle of sticks. The warranty transfer or deed and grant deed transfers the entire bundle. A quit claim deed transfers none of it. So what you risk by doing a quit claim is ultimately you can kind of cloud title and screw up the process a little bit if you're trying to sell the property at some point, or somebody's trying to get financing to buy the property at some point.
Okay,
So yeah, grant deed or general warranty deed are good, and they're usually the exact same, usually the same price in most places. So I would just get the grant or the general warranty deed and skip the quick claim because you could cause yourself headaches down the road if you're not careful.
good. Isabel, I transferred all of her properties into an irrevocable trust. Now the trust owns the LLCs. Is she off the hook?
Depends what you mean by off the hook, because technically for the irrevocable trust, you sort of lose control of those. So if you're in a position where that doesn't hurt you, then you're probably in a decent position. The only other thing I would say is I'm hoping that the irrevocable trust was drafted as what's referred to, and this is a weird phrase, a weird term of art for attorneys, but intentionally defective, so that at least the income taxes are flowing through to you as an individual versus being trust taxed at the trust limit. Because if they're being taxed at the trust amount, after I think about the first $12,000, it goes up to almost 40% in taxes. So hopefully it was done correctly. I've seen lots of them out there. They're usually very expensive, and it's usually about a coin flip on if they're done well or not. So, but
Okay.
the irrevocable trust is an asset protection tool that works. Trusted, and I think the next question is for you. Trust
Yep.
is in
Same
Nevada,
thing.
properties in New York. Yeah, so if it's a NAPT, then yeah, they're protected, and even after 2 years, everything is completely locked in.
Okay. Beverly, I sold 3 properties in Indiana. I'm looking for a way to save money on taxes as I am in the due diligence stage of a sale. Can I do anything after? So are we talking about avoiding capital gains taxes after you've sold the properties? Is that how you read that?
That's how I read it. And the first thing that flashes in my mind is a 1031 exchange, because it sounds like if you're still in the due diligence stage, you haven't quite sold the properties yet. So if that is the case, Beverly, I would suggest looking at a 1031 exchange, using a good qualified intermediary and get to identifying those properties so you can get them closed within the 180 days you have to close new properties.
But if she's already closed on them and taken the money in her possession,
It's
can't
you
do a
can
1031.
you're a little bit lost on that one, yeah.
Yep. Okay. What are the implications for real estate gift?
So the tax implications for a real estate gift are a little bit they kind of stink. So let's just run a scenario because I think that's the best way to look at these things. Let's say my parents bought a property in Texas for $10,000 back in the 70s, and now it's current times it's worth 170. Yeah, yeah, 170. The downside is if they gave that to me as a gift, I would get that at their original purchase price, not at the current value. So it's actually better to inherit real estate in that regard because it is referred to as steps up in basis, and you would actually inherit the property at the current market value. So if you sold it that day, there would be zero tax when you sold it. So you get all the benefit, none of the risk. So yeah, I would say if there's a scenario where you're either looking to get a property as a gift from a parent or friend or something like that, better to inherit it than to get it as a gift.
And then again, this might be one where we encourage you to do a consult because there are 5 or 6 states that have an inheritance tax, not
Yes.
just an estate tax, but an inherit. So if you receive a gift, there's going to be a tax on that, and be careful of that, and that because that can come as unwelcome surprise. Okay, you know what? We're going to take questions for about 4 or 5 more minutes, and then we're going to do our best to just encourage you to do a consult. But we
Yeah.
do have to cut this off. Okay.
Okay.
I'm looking to purchase two small properties in Florida for later use. Would it be more beneficial to purchase under an LLC or simply in my name and then transfer it into the land trust? Live in Florida.
So, okay, so living in Florida, number one thing I would look at is hopefully you have a insurance that you work with already that will be friendly to you because it's getting harder and harder to get insurance in both California and Florida. Number one. Number two is your interest rate. If you're purchasing it as an individual, is most likely going to be lower. So yeah, that's probably something you consider as well. If you purchase it under your individual name, I certainly would then use a land trust in Florida. Number one, for the transfer tax issues with the stamp tax there, as well as you're going to want to have the ability to put the property to have the beneficiary be an LLC. So I would say, what's the most reasonable or what's the most likely scenario? I think most likely and reasonable is you probably purchase it as an individual, so you get the better interest rate, but then you immediately set up the land trust, and after maybe a few months of paying the mortgage, transfer it over to the land trust, and then you can sort of move the beneficial interest around wherever you want because that's a private document.
Okay. Do land trusts differ from state to state?
So, sort of. So, some states have land trust laws, some do not, but they're accepted in all 50 states under federal guidelines because, like I mentioned during that little section where I said my little friend that helps us solve problems, is it's because ultimately they're grantor trust, which are the same family of trusts as living trusts. So they're federally accepted, even if the state doesn't have specific rules. So the places that have specific land trust rules that give them a little bit of protection, not complete protection, but a little bit of protection, are Florida and Illinois.
But whoever wrote this, land trusts are a specialty tool. We don't use them in all cases. I've had students that have hundreds of properties and very rarely use a land trust. If you're trying to avoid a mortgage or if you've got, there's reasons why to avoid a transfer tax or a stamp tax, but we don't use them in every situation. It's a specialty tool. Does Anderson help with filing taxes also? I think you mentioned that, but cover that again, would you?
Yeah, we do. So yeah, we do business and personal taxes as well as tax planning. Actually, I'm pretty sure everybody on here is probably familiar with Scott Estel as well. He and Toby work together to put together some interesting content as well. So yeah, we work with Scott Estel as well, and we do taxes. So yeah, we actually will do your personal and business taxes if you'd like us to.
Okay. Um, Watching from my phone, you can either scan the QR code or go to that link, click on that link, or I guess you could type it into your browser. Either one would get you the consult.
I imagine if you took a screenshot as well, it would be you might be able to snag the QR code and get it later.
Okay. If a relative lives in a house does not pay rent, kick them out. Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's not the question.
That's the Dave
Property,
Ramsey show, Don. That's not your show.
yeah, sorry. Property owner pays expenses like property tax, insurance, gardening. Can it be treated as a rental property and have deductions?
Most times it's still not going to pass muster at the end of the day if you're still living there.
Okay.
So you might be able to do a fraction of it under 280A where you're basically your corporation is reimbursing you for up to about 20% of your overall house usage. So you'll get some benefit there, but usually you can't treat it as an investment property from a tax perspective if you're still living there, or it has to
But
be
if it's
proportional at best.
but the relative lives in the house.
Yeah.
He's just paying the property taxes, the insurance, and that stuff. Um, the maintenance, utilities. You're
Oh,
not
okay. So
collecting
so
rent. You're
yeah,
just
if you don't
taking
live in
care
the
of it.
house, it's just your relative living in the house, and they're just a freeloader, then yeah, you can deduct those things.
Yeah. Okay. We're gonna we're gonna treat him as a squatter. Okay. Good. I think I I know we haven't got through all of them. Um, Don, nothing came through on the chat. Oh, you didn't see the chat. Hmm.
I see the link in chat.
you have to open up the chat screen. So go down to the bottom and open up the chat, and there's a link in there. Or I don't know. I guess we can't type it in the Q and A. Can they see the questions in the Q and A?
I don't think so.
I'm gonna type it to everyone. No, that goes to the chat. Call us. Um, Protect Wealth. Give us a call tomorrow. The number is 800-276-1430. I put that in the chat too, but if you can't see it, Protect Wealth. Protect Wealth Academy. We're all over the internet. Just look us up and call us, and we'll get you a link. Okay. Carl, thank you. I know we haven't got to all your questions. If we haven't done that, please sign up for a consult. Um, and we're not evading the questions. We've run out of time, and Carl, you've been very gracious. Thank you for your time and your expertise. Any closing remarks?
Yeah, just wanted to say thank you to you as well.
Oh,
And ultimately, if you have questions we didn't get to, perfect opportunity to set up for a consult. I'm happy to basically all those consults as well. You have 45 minutes with me, so you can ask questions to your face is blue. It won't take that whole time, most cases, but if it does, it does. So not a big deal.
and
But
there's the link, and there's
yeah,
the phone number.
yeah,
Carl,
that's my direct phone line. So if you call me and I'm on the phone pretty much the entire day. So if I'm not available, I will respond. If it's about scheduling, you'll get a call from my administrative assistant, whose number was apparently up on my screen the entire time. So those of you who are quick and took a screen grab of those, good for you. You've got my assistant's number. You can always reach out to them as well. I think overall we'd prefer if you probably reached out to Don's team first, and he'll forward you over. That way we can say, you're a Don Pendleton client, get them set up with the best advisor around, and you get set up with me. So
Carl, you're awesome. Students, thank you so much for being on. We know that we've kept you a long time. We don't want to take any more of your time, but we appreciate you being here. The recording of this will go out tomorrow for anyone who registered. Thank you very